Okay, so 7 o'clock, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody this evening to this presentation. My name is Michelle. I'm one of the members of Sunrise Cleveland, and this event is being co-hosted by several different organizations, including Sunrise, West Shore FACT and FACT Ohio, the Cuyahoga County Progressive Caucus, Northeast Ohio Sierra Club, and Northeast Ohio for a Green New Deal. We know these are really crazy, difficult, stressful times for a lot of people. So hopefully this will be not only informative, but empowering as well. Just to let everyone know in advance that your video and mic are probably going to be turned off during this, as this is being recorded. And our presenter tonight is Dr. Fadel Kaboub, who is an economics professor at Denison University and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And after the presentation, there'll be time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please just hold off until after the presentation is completed. And you can type your questions into the chat. If you're watching in Facebook live stream, you can type your questions in there and we'll try to get to as many as possible within the time allotted. So without further ado, Dr. Kaboub.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thank you for organizing this event. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and it's sharing the wrong window. So let me just do this for a second. There you go. There you go. Can you guys see my screen? Michelle?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Fadel Kaboub, and it's my pleasure to be with you tonight on this webinar on a new way forward, creating a resilient, just, and green economy. And the subtext of this presentation is understanding what kind of transformative policies we can afford, we can put in place today to undo the damage of climate change and to build a resilient economy. And the subtext is the Green New Deal, which is the boldest, most transformative policy we have on the table today as a nation. And the biggest question we face when people say this transformative, massive program to decarbonize the economy, to address inequality and so on, the big question is, how do you pay for it? And I'd like to introduce you to an economic framework called modern monetary theory, or MMT for short, that essentially explains how we can introduce all of these transformative policies without causing inflation, without bankrupting the country, without slipping into some sort of communist country or any of the issues you usually hear about in the media. And for those who are interested in MMT, or modern monetary theory, after this presentation, you should get a hold of a new book that's on the New York Times bestsellers by Stephanie Kelton, who's one of the leading MMT economists, and the book is called The Deficit Myth. So check it out. So to get started, I want to explain why we need to be radicals when it comes to thinking about climate change and thinking about the issues that we're facing. And I'm not afraid to use the term radical because I use it in the linguistic sense of the term. To be radical meaning to go to the roots of the problem. And if you're not going to the roots of the problem, then you're addressing this problem from a superficial standpoint. And superficial, policies essentially promote the status quo. And that's something that we can't afford. So what we have right now, we have deep structural problems, climate crisis, an inequality crisis, socioeconomic exclusion crisis, a dysfunctional political system. And I'm talking here about the US system in particular. And the establishment of the political system from the left and from the right is essentially looking for incremental bipartisan solutions, which means superficial solutions, which means status quo type of solutions. And here I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King in the context of the civil rights movement, when he said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drug of gradualism and incrementalism." And I mean it in the context of the climate crisis and the inequality crisis that we have today. Small, gradual, incremental solutions are essentially promoting the status quo because they don't address the roots of the problem. So I wanted to start with this to make sure that we're on the same page when we talk about the need for radical, transformative solutions that go to the roots of the problem, as opposed to small, incremental solutions. And the Green New Deal in particular, I'm going to go back to this picture in a second. The Green New Deal in particular has two interlinked goals. One is to decarbonize the economy and address climate change. And two is to address the inequality and socioeconomic exclusion crisis. And both are interlinked and both are important. And addressing one without the other will not be helpful for addressing the structural problems that we deal with. So I'm assuming everyone here is on the same page with me in terms of the extent of the climate crisis. I don't need to spend 15 minutes to, showcase all the science behind it. But I want to highlight one particular point on inequality. And it's this particular picture. And this is a graph by a colleague of mine, Pavlina Cherneva, who, by the way, just released her book called The Case for a Job Guarantee. And she's a leading economist in the MMT and the Green New Deal movement. And what Pavlina is showing in this graph is unbelievable in terms of the extent to which the inequality crisis is that we're facing today. So let me translate this in simple English. So the blue bars represents the bottom 90% of American families. And the red bars represent the top percent, the wealthiest 10%. So it used to be the case back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and so on, that every time we recover from a recession, this is showing the gains from the recovery. Who gets the gains from the recovery? Used to be that the majority of the gains of the recovery go to the bottom 90% of the population. And the top 10%, they get something, right? Like in this case, 80% of the gains went to the bottom 90% of the population, and 20% of the gains went to the top 10%. But then starting in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, we start seeing this massive switch in this trend where every time we recover from a recession, and this is the recovery from the recession, this is not the recession itself. So this is when things are getting better. Who's doing well when things are getting better? And we start getting to a point where the very last recession we faced, the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, more than 100% of the gains from the recovery went to the top 10%. And the bottom 90% of the population essentially lost ground. And I guarantee you, because we haven't done anything radical, transformative in the last 12 years to undo this trend, I guarantee you that as we recover from this crisis, we're going to see something similar to what we've seen in 2008, 2009, and possibly worse than this, because this is a trend and we haven't done anything to undo these patterns. And that's why I insist on the Green New Deal being something that addresses climate change to decarbonize the economy, and something that addresses this unsustainable pattern, unsustainable economically, socially, politically. So that's a major focal point. So what is the Green New Deal? In broad terms, it's federally funded. This is very important that we're not talking about local cities and states and counties raising money or borrowing money to pay for it. This has to be federally funded the same way the New Deal of the 1930s was federally funded. But it's locally implemented in a decentralized way. In other words, it's going to be local cities and municipalities and community organizations deciding what the priorities are in every district. And the funding will come through federal authorities. It's got to be urban and rural. Well, we can't just say that the jobs are going to be in San Francisco and New York, and that's where everybody needs to go. We have to address economic inequality in urban and in rural areas, and decarbonize both urban and rural areas. It has to be inclusive, and I'm going to underline this here for a second, because the New Deal of the 1930s was not exclusive. What was not inclusive. inclusive. It excluded African Americans in particular. So it has to be inclusive. It has to be just in the sense of a just transition for workers who will lose their jobs in the fossil fuel industry, for example. So when we say we want to decarbonize and end the fossil fuel industry, we don't mean we're going to end the livelihood of people in that industry. So a just transition means a job guarantee with decent wages and benefits for everyone who's going to lose their jobs in the fossil fuel industry and transition into a new economy. And that includes job training, and that includes all kinds of programs to make sure that everybody is treated fairly and nobody's left behind. And it has to be restorative in the sense of rebuilding both the economic infrastructure and the social fabric that's been destroyed over the last 40 or 50 years in the United States. It has to be comprehensive and permanent. Comprehensive in the sense of, we can't have a Green New Deal of just solar panels and think that we've done something great. It has to be something that addresses not just the way we produce energy and produce it in a clean way, but we have to think of everything we produce and consume and transport. We have to invest billions of dollars in research and development on material science so that every product we produce sort of comes with a user manual that also has a living will that says this is how you dispose of this product, and every single component of that product has a way of going back into what we call the circular economy, which means we have to build the infrastructure for recapturing every single component into that circular economy. So that's what I mean by comprehensive. And it has to be permanent. We can't go back in 10 years or in 20 years and say, now let's go back to fossil fuels. We're done with the fossil fuel era. So the big question, how are we going to pay for it? And this is what we're usually told in the mainstream media and kind of the popular discourse. We're told that, for some reason, the slides are not moving. Oh, there you go. We're told that the government is broke, we're running out of dollars, the rich will never agree to pay taxes, the national debt is going to be a huge burden on future generations, and then you hear the whole thing about inflation and hyperinflation in Zimbabwe and Venezuela and the Weimar Republic. We can't afford all this additional spending. And then people say, oh, we need to borrow more money from China and we can't afford that. So this is the standard view that you hear all the time, and I'd like to invite you to call this bluff. Because this is not how the federal government pays for things. This has never been the case in the history of the US. So let's see how things actually work. And I usually, for some reason, oh, there you go. Usually use the example of World War II, but in recent weeks, I've been using the example of the CARES Act. So how did we pay for World War II? The most expensive program in the history of the United States. It came right after the Great Depression, the most miserable time in US history. There was no money to be taxed, and there was no money to be borrowed during the Great Depression. There's no money to be borrowed in the US, and there was no money to be borrowed abroad either, because it was a global Great Depression. So where did the money come from to pay for World War II? How can we afford this massive program? Did we say that let's wait and see how the thing is happening in Europe and Germany? Maybe let's do some incremental or gradualist policy to win World War II. Obviously, that was not the case. You can't win World War II by sending 10,000 troops every other week. You have to engage in this thing in a massive, with the bold intervention, which was the case during World War II. So where did the money come from? In the same way the federal government spends on everything, starting from World War II, the CARES Act, every military budget, 535 people, our representatives in Washington, D.C., they put a proposal on the table. If you get the majority vote in the House and the Senate, that particular bill is passed and the spending happens, which means there was no need during World War II for the government to borrow first or to tax anybody during the Great Depression in order to afford the war. The spending happens when the government uses the power of the purse. And that's a privilege that the federal government has, that you and I don't have, that states and municipalities don't have. So everything I'm talking about here in terms of MMT and this power of the purse is the power of the federal government, which is why I said a minute ago that the Green New Deal must be federally funded, not at the local level, but federally funded. Same thing with the CARES Act. Just a few days before the CARES Act, before this pandemic started, almost everybody in Washington, D.C. was convinced and saying it publicly on TV, on national radio, and so on. They were saying, we can't afford the Green New Deal. We can't afford Medicare for all. We don't have money. We're going to have to tax people so much to pay for these trillions of dollars. And we're going to have to borrow from China and the rest of the world. But then the pandemic started and the CARES Act was on the table. 535 people showed up to vote and they voted to approve it. And $2.2 trillion were created out of thin air. That's the power of the purse of the US federal government. And nobody said, who are we going to tax to pay for the CARES Act? Who are we going to borrow from to pay for the CARES Act? And just to add a little anecdote to this CARES Act thing, not only did the federal government spend $2.2 trillion into existence, but at the same time, the federal government said, by the way, on April 15th, when your taxes are due, don't worry about it. We're going to postpone your tax payments until July 15th. So the government doesn't even need the tax revenues or the borrowing in order to spend $2.2 trillion on the pandemic relief or on military budgets or on World War II or on the Green New Deal. So the question is, does that mean that the government can just spend unlimited amounts of money? The answer is no. There are limits, but the limits are not constrained by tax revenues and borrowing capacity. And I'll explain those limits in a minute. So for some reason, the slides don't move easily here. So the power of the purse. The first thing that we have to recognize is that the federal government budget is not the same thing as a household budget. So whereas you and I, businesses, states and municipalities, we have to earn an income first in order to spend it. And if we want to spend beyond our income, we have to borrow from a bank, from a friend, from a credit card company, or whatever. The same is true for your states and cities. They have to tax in order to spend. They can borrow up to a certain limit. But once you borrow and you have a debt, you have to be able to pay it off eventually. And the only way to pay it off is by earning more revenues in the future or tightening your belts and spending less. The federal government doesn't operate in that way. So government spending is not constrained by tax revenues at the federal level, and it's not constrained by borrowing capacity. So government spending at the federal level is constrained by the risk of inflation. So notice I didn't say that the government has unlimited spending capacity. I said it has a limit, and that limit is inflation. And if you can see what I'm symbolizing here with my hands, think of the fiscal policy space or the spending space of the federal government as something that's not constrained by tax revenues, which is what most people think, but it's actually constrained by the inflation risk, which turns out to be much, much larger spending capacity, spending space. So that limit of the inflation risk is something that MMT has spent quite a bit of time explaining. So what determines that risk of inflation? It's two things. The first thing is the productive capacity of the economy. In other words, as long as we have skilled workers to do the job, as long as we have the technology, the know-how, the physical productive resources to do things, we will not face inflation risk as long as we can employ those resources and get things done. So the good news about this, even if we have a little bit of shortage of productive capacity in a particular industry, that's an opportunity to create jobs, to build more resources, to train more people in that particular industry. The second source of inflation is a bit tricky, politically speaking, because the second source of inflation is areas of the economy where you have key players, major industries, who actually can charge higher prices and raise their prices because they can or because we let them, because they have too much market power. And that type of inflation, you're not going to get rid of it by spending more or spending less. You're going to get rid of it by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence. In other words, you make their industry more competitive by regulation. The problem here is the lawmakers who regulate those industries, the 535 people we elect to Washington, D.C., A lot of them happen to be elected via campaign contributions from super PACs, from big pharma and Wall Street and oil companies and so on. So it's understandable, quote unquote, understandable, that they're not going to tax and regulate the market power out of existence of their campaign contributors. So this is going to be the tricky part, because if we're going to be able to increase our spending capacity and eliminate or minimize the risk of inflation, we're going to have to tackle this particular issue of too much market power by particular individuals and corporations. What I call here the price setters. So we're talking about a paradigm shift, economically speaking and politically speaking. So this MMT framework implies the following. A lot of people hear MMT and they say, wait a minute, are you saying we don't need to tax anybody? The government can just spend? Notice I didn't say that, and that's why I have this particular slide to highlight the important role of taxes at the federal level. So at the state and local level, yes, we have to tax this to pay for that. That's absolutely true. But at the federal level, taxes play a completely different role. So what we're going to do, we're going to decouple the spending from the taxing at the federal level. So first, we're going to spend on the national priorities. Those priorities can include healthcare, education, decarbonizing the economy, whatever it is, the power of the purse, the federal government can use it and set the priorities straight based on the democratic needs of our society. Remember, it's a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So you use the power of the purse to serve the needs of the people. So that's the spending part. You spend to increase or improve productive capacity in strategic areas such as healthcare and education and so on. But then when it comes to taxing, you tax pollution, you tax speculation, you tax extreme wealth, not because you want to generate revenues for the federal government, because remember, the federal government doesn't need revenues like you and I in order to spend. It spends money into existence. So then what is the purpose of taxing pollution and taxing extreme wealth and speculation if it's not to raise dollars to spend? So you tax to protect democracy from oligarchy. You tax excessive wealth to reduce their power and influence in politics, their power and influence in the economy. That's essentially to protect democracy. You tax pollution because you want to reduce pollution and eliminate fossil fuels. You tax to reduce excessive inequality, to reduce abusive market power. You tax speculation to prevent financial instability, right, caused by Wall Street. So we don't need, money or permission from the wealthy or from the polluters or from Wall Street in order to spend on health and education and the Green New Deal, because the government has the power of the purse. And that changes now our philosophy. Instead of thinking we need to tax the excessive wealth and speculation and pollution in order to fund schools and public health and so on, and that's what we usually call redistribution, I'd like you to think of pre-distribution, so that we spend the right way in the first place, instead of having to constantly redistribute. So this is point number one. Let's think of pre-distribution instead of redistribution. Point number two, it's a point of logic, because most of us in the environmental movement and the progressive movement, we say, oh, we want to tax Wall Street so we can fund healthcare. But wait a minute, if we want to have a more ambitious healthcare program that happens to be more expensive, based on that logic, in order for us to afford a more ambitious healthcare program, we need Wall Street to be even wealthier and more powerful in order to tax them a little bit of their wealth to fund a more ambitious healthcare program. That just defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do. So when you think of pre-distribution, when you decouple the taxing from spending, you're not locked into this, logic that's kind of like shooting yourself in the foot. If you're trying to have a more ambitious Green New Deal program, you need fossil fuel companies to be wealthier and more powerful. If anything, we want them to be less powerful. We want to reduce their power and influence in politics and the economy and decarbonize the economy. That's the purpose of taxation. And finally, we want to regulate markets to reduce this excessive market power, to reduce this price setting behavior and corruption, to be honest. The link between the super PACs and the powerful influence in Washington, D.C., in terms of their influence on senators and Congress people is unsustainable politically, economically. It's counter to every single principle of this democracy. When we say a government of the people, by the people, for the people, we never said a government of the super PACs, by the super PACs, for the super PACs. So that's got to be addressed fundamentally. So I'm asking for this paradigm shift in the way we think about how the government works, so that as a democratic society, we demand the execution of public policy based on democratic principles that allow us to move this agenda forward. So hashtag goals. But can we afford this? People say, can we afford this massive Green New Deal? And my rhetorical question here is, can we afford these pictures from Appalachia? Can we afford this? This is a few months ago in Pennsylvania. Can we afford the forest fires in California? Can we afford the floods in the Midwest? Right? So we have to shift the narrative about what is affordable. Because my argument here, and I'm getting ready to close in a few minutes and open it up for questions. My argument here is that the status quo, doing nothing, is already too expensive. And what I'm asking us to implement, the Green New Deal, is actually going to be the cheaper, more affordable option. So here's how we change the metric and change the narrative. So I'd like you to take a look at this. When they say we need to support fracking all over Appalachia because that's going to be creating jobs, that's going to be creating tax revenues for local school districts and so on, I want you to call their bluff, because what they're asking us to do and the metric that they're using, and politicians all over the country say this, they say we need economic growth. When they say economic growth, they're talking about this graph right here, which is GDP, gross domestic product. So if we unpack this for a second, GDP is essentially a metric that measures the total dollar amount of all goods and services produced within a year, right? The annual GDP. And as that number grows from year to year, we call it economic growth. So that's what they mean by economic growth. So the problem with GDP is that it measures so many things that actually reduce our quality of life. For example, if we have an oil spill and we spend hundreds of millions of dollars to clean it up, to clean up the mess, all of that amount of money that we're spending shows up as economic growth, and it gets celebrated on TV as economic growth. Every time we build prisons, we buy more locks and to put on our doors, we buy security cameras and alarm systems because you live in unsafe environment. All of that spending shows up as economic growth, but is it really improving our quality of life? Of course not. So what some economists, ecological economists, have done over the years is develop an alternative metric that essentially takes the GDP numbers, this thing that everybody talks about on TV and celebrates economic growth, and then they remove all of those negative effects that reduce our quality of life. And what you end up with is something called the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI. And this, as you can tell, for the last 40 years, quality of life has been flat, stagnant for decades, whereas GDP has been growing. And of course, all the wealth is going to the top 10%, the top 1%. So changing the narrative without changing the metric is not going to be, helpful for our agenda to mobilize resources in the right direction. So now, as an informed citizen, if you want your quality of life to improve, this is the metric that you want policymakers to target. So then the question here pops up. So what are the investments, public policy investments, that will actually increase GPI? So forget about GDP now, because we know it's not reflecting our quality of life. Then the whole list pops up. And that's essentially what you have in the Green New Deal. Decarbonize the economy. Those jobs tend to be more resilient during recessions, by the way. They pay higher wages, and they're better for the environment. They're better for our quality of life. So then it turns out that investment in education and public health and clean environment, are the things that will actually raise GDP, raise GPI, the genuine progress indicator. So changing the metric is going to be very important for changing the narrative. And then, you know, it becomes easier to have a public discourse about the choices that we make as a society. And this is something in a way that's really not political, because when you think of people who are, you know, conservative versus progressives or whatever, common sense is common sense. So for example, would we rather as a society, you know, invest in after school programs to inspire kids with music and theater and sports and science and technology and summer camps and things like that, or not do that because it's too expensive and we think it's not affordable, and instead build a $500 million prison in the same city 10 or 15 years later and deal with the opioid crisis and deal with all the negative effects of unemployment and school dropout and things of that nature. Another example, wouldn't we rather spend money upfront today, a little bit of money upfront today, to clean up the environment, to invest in clean energy, or not do that and instead end up with, you know, cancer treatment for the next 30 years for everybody in the city, right? Because that's not expensive. Expensive in terms of the financial cost, but also in the pain that families suffer from with all of these negative effects of pollution. So what I'm talking about here is common sense that everybody can embrace. And all of these investments will increase quality of life, increase GPI, and will cost us less in the long term in terms of financial cost and economic and social and emotional pain. And then the next question that people, you know, always have is, what about inflation? All of this spending that we're putting in the economy. So there's a paradigm shift also happening in the economics profession, where the old ideas that claim that more government spending and more government debt automatically leads to inflation has been completely debunked and admitted by mainstream economists. So this is not me saying it. This is the Fed, for example, here in the Financial Times, saying essentially we have no reliable theory of inflation. In other words, we have no idea what causes inflation. And MMT has a valid theory that explains how inflation happens. As I said earlier, it's shortage of productive capacity. That's the easy part to deal with. The second one is more political. It has to do with corruption, political corruption, which is market power, abusive market power by key players. And we can name them in the US. It's the healthcare industry, health insurance industry. It's, you know, the fossil fuel industry, it's Wall Street and so on. So that kind of inflation, you tax and regulate their market power out of existence. And that takes bold action on the political front. So to be more specific, there are 4 areas that drive inflation in the US today. And this is before putting in place any Green New Deal or anything. The first one is healthcare. The second one is college education. The third one is housing or real estate. And the fourth one is energy and transportation, which is why my worst nightmare is for somebody in the political, you know, space to hijack the Green New Deal label and introduce a Green New Deal that doesn't address these sources of inflation. And then they're going to spend quite a bit of money. And of course, it's going to feed into the inflation machine of market power in these areas. And then it's going to cause inflation, going to say, aha, we told you this Green New Deal is going to cause inflation, it's going to bankrupt the country. So that's why those of us on the front lines of fighting for the Green New Deal on the economic front, we insist on including these 4 components to automatically deal with inflation. For example, Medicare for all is included in the Green New Deal package, not because it's one of the favorite, you know, shopping list items of the progressive movement, but because it plays a particular role to dealing with inflation. So Medicare for all will cost less, and it will address the market power, the abusive market power of the healthcare industry, of the health insurance industry. That's how you deal with that type of inflation. That's why we include college and vocational training for all, to reduce the cost, to increase our productive capacity in strategic areas that we need for the future. That's why we include home guarantees and rent control in the Green New Deal, because that's how you address the inflationary pressure from the real estate industry. And that's why, obviously, we want to decarbonize the economy, to reduce the power and influence of the energy and transportation industry, and to clean up the environment, obviously. So we can't have a Green New Deal without having these four strategic components that address the market power and the productive capacity in the US economy today. Other countries will have to do Green New Deals of different kinds because their inflation pressure points are different items. But you can't, have massive spending without keeping an eye always focused on inflation and what causes inflation. And finally, I want to highlight the federal job guarantee as a core feature of a Green New Deal, not just as a nice add-on to the shopping list. And I alluded to it earlier when I talked about the importance of a just transition for workers who will be displaced from the fossil fuel industry and other industries, to be honest, because the economy is transforming as we move forward. So if we understand the power of the purse of the government and the inflation risk that I explained earlier, then the spending and the national priorities become the following three tiers, in my opinion. The first one is what I call universal public services, and that includes green infrastructure, Medicare for all, housing for all, education and vocational training for all, childcare, and all of these things we can afford. The next tier is a federal job guarantee that guarantees a job at a living wage with benefits for people who want to work. And there are millions of people who want to work. And I'm talking pre-pandemic, there were millions of people who couldn't get jobs. When everybody was saying we're at full employment, there was millions of people left behind. And then the third tier is a generous income support for people who cannot or should not work. And by the way, during the pandemic, a lot of people were saying, oh, universal basic income is the solution. We don't need a job guarantee. To me, during the pandemic, the most important job in a federal job guarantee is things like contact tracers, things like doing wellness checks on the elderly and so on. But also one of the most important jobs is staying at home and not spreading the virus. So to me, this framework of these three tiers is very, very important. And those of you who are interested in the job guarantee, please check out jobguaranteenow.org. And there's a statement there for people to sign and endorse and gather more information about the job guarantee. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions and gather your thoughts and feedback. And thank you again for listening.
So you can just type any questions that you have to Professor Kaboub in the chat. I think Ken, go ahead and is going to read them.
Okay, we have from Greg Coleridge. Yes, the government currently can and should create money as credit. But is that not what's currently happening? They're creating money as debt when they seek government bills, bonds, and notes, which adds to the federal debt.
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, and the short answer is yes, but the government is already doing what MMT is describing. So MMT is not sort of a new theory that needs to be applied. MMT is just describing how the federal government has always functioned. But what we're saying is that we're shining a light on the way the government spends, and we're saying the government is spending on different priorities, not the priorities of the people, for the people, by the people. Right? So it's never been a question when we're about to, allocate $800 billion to the Pentagon. Nobody says, where's the money coming from? Who are we going to tax? Who are we going to borrow from? That's never an issue. It's never an issue when we're about to, put on the table trillions of dollars worth of tax cut. Nobody says who's going to pay for it. But when it comes to the Green New Deal, say, how are you going to pay for it? Where's the money going to come from? And that's hypocritical. Right? So we need to be able to push back against that hypocrisy and say, you're in office, you're elected democratically by the people, you need to represent the voice of the people, and as a result, spend accordingly, tax accordingly, regulate accordingly. So that's the short answer. And then what's alluded to in the question, if I heard it correctly, is the reference to a rising level of national debt. I'm not concerned about the rising level of national debt. A lot of people panic when they hear the national debt, and it's usually used as a scare tactic to cut spending on social services and environmental issues, because the national debt at the federal level is not the same thing as the debt of your state or city or your personal debt or corporate debt. Remember, we decoupled the spending from taxing at the federal level. And the first bullet point we started with is that the federal government is not the same thing as a household budget or a business budget, right? We're not operating on the same scale. So to give you one counterexample, Japan has had the largest national debt as a percentage of GDP in the world, in the developed world for sure, now standing at 250% of GDP. And for the last 30 years, having this record level of national debt, they didn't even have a hint of inflation. They didn't even have a hint of bankruptcy. Why? Because the entire national debt of Japan, just like the entire national debt of the United States, is denominated in Japanese yen in the case of Japan, and the entire national debt of the US is denominated in US dollars, which means when those payments come due, the US federal government can always make payments. It can never be insolvent. The thing that matters is not the national debt of the federal government. The thing that matters is the debt of the private sector. These are areas that we need to unwind, especially the corporate sector and household sector. It's massive amounts of debt that most people are familiar with.
Okay, thank you. Joan Grace asked, can you please re-show your last slide?
I'm happy to do that. The last slide, which was, I'm assuming not this one, but the one about the 3 tiers, maybe? If not, please type your comment and I'll switch the slides.
Okay, I'll check back with her.
And I'm happy to share these slides, by the way, with anybody. I mean, this live stream will be recorded and available for everybody to watch.
Okay. Another question from Catalina Maddox Wagner, I believe. What is your position about people who can work but do not want to work?
So people who can work but don't want to work. There's usually an issue behind it. I mean, there's a subtext there. If we're talking about people who don't want to work because the work environment, the workplace environment is not, treating them with dignity, if the job doesn't pay well, if the job doesn't have benefits, if it turns out that, welfare benefits actually offer you more than what you can do on the job, or if the job, pays, a minimum wage, but you can't afford childcare or you can't afford elderly care. So there's a lot of details that go beyond, behind that statement that I don't feel comfortable just answering it as a general statement, because the majority of people want to work if there is a job that pays a decent wage, that treats them well, that has a safe workplace environment, and if they're paid well enough to be able to take care of their kids or elderly, family members who need healthcare or somebody to take care of them at home. Which is why I go back to that universal public services that includes childcare and elderly care and so on. All of these things we can afford in the US, because once those things are covered, once we have living wage jobs as a minimum, then we get to that particular question. Then it becomes a very small, tiny minority of individuals who may have, in some cases, health issues, mental health issues, substance abuse issues, whatever those issues are. As a society, we need to be able to get to a point where we not only guarantee a job, but we guarantee a job with a package of benefits that include mental health, that includes, because if somebody's dealing with an addiction, right, and you offer them a job and you say you have to show up every day at 8 o'clock, and they can't because they physically or mentally can't, we can't just throw them out and say, well, now the job guarantee doesn't work, because we're setting them up to fail. So I'd like to answer that question with all of these nuances in mind.
Okay. All right. We have Marilyn Klee. Where does national security slant military spending fit in this scheme? What would be a sensible defense policy position?
Okay, that's a big question. So when it comes to U.S. military spending, you have to think of this in a kind of very intersectional way. Because if the role that the US wants to play in the world is policing the world and coercing countries into particular behavior, then you're going to need a lot of military spending to do that. But if it's going to be, the role of the US is going to be more the role of the State Department, the role of diplomacy, the role of cooperation on solving economic issues, on addressing root causes of conflict, as opposed to treating every conflict with a military response, then it's going to be a different way of running U.S. foreign policy, right? So, for example, the so-called war on drugs, militarizing the border, all of these, militaristic responses that cost a lot of money and a lot of human lives, ultimately, can be dealt with at the roots of the problem. Because if you're looking at the war on drugs as something that, that's exacerbated by armament and conflict, if you're looking at the migration crisis as, people leaving their homes and packing their kids and walking hundreds and hundreds of miles to seek safety as an economic problem, then you treat that from an economic and social standpoint with financial resources that end up creating better quality of life for those individuals and their families and their communities, and saving everybody's lives and saving so much, money on the U.S. side from military spending. So it's a complex issue that requires a complete rethinking of how you address, quote unquote, security problems, because not all security problems, emanate from purely security sources. They usually have an economic and social, and in many cases, and increasingly, it's going to be climate-driven, quote unquote, security situations. So, for example, I grew up in the Middle East, so I have to reference this. The Syrian conflict, with the Syrian refugee crisis, for example, millions of people moving to Europe and other parts of the world, is always treated as a civil war issue, right? There was a war and people left the country, and now we have a refugee crisis. When the Syrian refugees actually started moving, 3 years before the first bullet was even fired in Syria, because of a major drought, a massive drought that displaced 1.5 million people from rural areas to urban areas, that started putting so much social and economic and political pressure on the major cities in Syria during the worst economic time in 2008, when food prices were very high. And Syria used to be a self-sufficient country in terms of food. And during that drought, it became a net importer of food during 2008, when food prices were going through the roof because of the 2008 speculation. Because 2008 also, there was bad, droughts all over the world. So major exporters of wheat, like the Russians and Ukraine and Australia, they too had, bad seasons. So food prices were going through the roof, and Syria was shopping for food during that crisis. That's when the refugee crisis started. It's a climate-induced crisis. And there are millions of climate refugees on the move as we speak. We just don't see them as climate refugees because we eventually see the conflict over resources turning into a civil war, turning into a border conflict or whatever. But these are climate-induced conflicts. So if we're going to deal with it with the military intervention, we're not going to solve the problem. We're going to make it worse. So addressing climate change, addressing the root causes of migration, especially climate-induced migration, is going to save us a lot of time. It's going to save millions of lives. And these problems are just going to accelerate as we move forward. And to close this with one comment, just to leave this kind of thought in the back of your mind, that as we speak, the science is very clear that within my lifetime, the Middle East, the Gulf region in particular, will be uninhabitable during the summer months, which means 300 million climate refugees moving all over the world. And that's going to put so much pressure on housing issues, on food issues, and of course, it's going to be the wealthiest who will move first, and it's going to be the most vulnerable who will be left behind, who will be, the victims of this. And if we think of it as a security issue, we should think of it as an economic, as a climate issue first.
All right. So Sam C. Says, so the Green New Deal is not all about green stuff. We have Medicare for all, housing, etc. I thought Green New Deal is about curbing pollution.
It's both. As I said earlier, it's both. It's decarbonizing the economy and addressing inequality. And inequality is multifaceted. It has to do with access to energy, access to housing, access to healthcare. We can't just green the economy and ignore all of these things. And the reason it's called the Green New Deal is because of a reference of the New Deal of the 1930s. The New Deal of the 1930s was not about decarbonizing anything. It was 100% about the economy, about inequality. Because the level of inequality that we have right now in the US, and I've shown you the graph in the beginning of this presentation, we haven't seen that since the Great Depression. And that is unsustainable. Economically, socially, politically unsustainable. So we're facing this double crisis, and we have this platform that can address both things at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Doreen Papacek, how do we change from a humanist platform versus a socialist platform? Are there any other models that we can draw from? And aren't we the GDP?
Okay, so broad question, and I'm not sure where to start. So let me say a few words and see if this makes sense. Humanist versus, what was the other term?
A humanist platform. How do we change from a humanist platform versus a socialist platform?
Well, I'm not sure what to make of that. So let me address it from the perspective that I think this person is asking. I try not to put these labels with isms on it, capitalism or socialism or democratic socialism, because these terms get hijacked into so many different directions and have so many different meanings. I'd like to approach this from the following perspective, and then we can invent a name and put an ism on it and call it whatever we want to call it. So I'd like to highlight the fact that we in the United States can afford financially to invest in all of these things, in healthcare and education and decarbonizing the economy, but we have to be able to do it in a democratic way, and we can't do this democratically if we have a few individuals, corporations in particular, who run Congress and who set the priorities for their bottom line. So we have to address this head on, politically speaking. We're not changing the foundations of the existing system, if you want to call it capitalism. Capitalism is about private property, it's about competition, it's about freedom of choice, right? It's about self-interest. We're not removing any of these things. We're not getting rid of private property. We're not getting rid of competition. If anything, we want to enhance competition. That's really the problem, is that we don't have enough competition in some of these areas. We're not going to get rid of self-interest. We're not going to get rid of any of the foundations of capitalism. It might be a different variety of capitalism than the one we currently have, that's for sure. And if you want to call it something else and stick an ism to it, so be it. But I'm not sure that thing is socialism or humanism or whatever label we want to put on it. And then finally, the reference to GDP. Again, I'm not sure what the question means, but GDP is a monetary value, and it's not about us. It's about the things that we produce and their monetary value. If anything, we want to switch to something that's more reflective of us and our quality of life, and that's GPI. That's what I outlined earlier, which measures the quality of life. And quality of life, as I've shown, has been stagnant for the last 40 years, and these investments that I'm putting on the table, the Green New Deal investments, are essentially designed to raise the quality of life and raise that indicator, GPI indicator.
Okay, from Jim Whitman, it's difficult to believe COVID-19 will be the last pandemic. Should pandemics be in the list of future essential priorities?
Yeah, so what we're talking about here is resilience to these shocks. And what the COVID-19 pandemic has done is really shine this bright light and expose some structural deficiencies in our system. For example, when we were told to, go home and work remotely, many of us living in rural areas found it really difficult. And I'm a teacher, and I had to come to campus. Like I'm doing this webinar specifically now from my office, not from my home, because my internet is not reliable, and I'm not in the most remote area in Ohio. Many of my students couldn't, have reliable internet connections to connect to class on a regular basis. So just like the New Deal of the 1930s introduced the rural electrification program, we need a rural brandification program for our generation today. Yes, this pandemic may not be the last, so we need to build, a new economic system that's more resilient, not just on the broadband front for people who can work remotely, but also on the public health front. I mean, and this is kind of a no-brainer that we don't have the capacity to do, kind of a massive response to a healthcare crisis like the one we've seen, the one that we're still dealing with, and we may still be dealing with this for many months to come. So absolutely, part of the resilience is healthcare, education, infrastructure, and we can do all of this in a greener and cleaner and more sustainable way.
Okay, this is also related to the pandemic from Ron Prosek. The trillions spent almost overnight to address the pandemic was a revelation to me. Not even Republicans balked. Do you think this has resonated with the public so that they might better understand how the government can fund what the people need?
I hope so, but I'm not very, I'm cautiously optimistic, let me put it this way. And the reason is a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now, you may have seen a statement by 60 lawmakers, bipartisan, I think, that essentially said, well, we can't continue this level of spending. We need to go back to, financial prudence, which means they want to cut spending. No more relief, in other words. We've heard Mitch McConnell, he said, go file for bankruptcy, speaking to states and municipalities, right? So the fiscally conservative voices are pushing back. They didn't have anything to say during the CARES Act because there was no other option and they couldn't be the only ones opposing it. But now that, they're getting, the economy reopened, quote unquote reopened. We'll see how well that will go. I mean, 32 states as of today have rising cases of COVID-19, so they may have to shut down again. But also, there's a clear message from the federal government that they're not considering more spending of the kind that we've seen during the CARES Act. So this is why I do this. It's a public education and empowering people with the narrative that allows us to push back against these cuts and to realign the priorities of the people with the priorities that Congress is going to vote on. And if we don't make it clear to policymakers that we know better, that we have a clear understanding of what we can afford, and we have a clear understanding of who's standing in the way, then they're going to keep doing what they've been doing before. So again, this is a political issue. There's no other way of putting it. And if politicians get a message that says you're going to be unseated if you don't vote for the public priorities, if you vote for the priorities of the oil companies, the fracking companies, and if they get that clear message from their constituents, they're going to have to change the way they do things.
Okay. From Timothy New, You mentioned that the Green New Deal will be implemented out on a federal level, but adapted to localities based on situations. How much freedom will localities have in interpreting how they carry out the Green New Deal?
So there has to be guidelines. So think of this in terms of federal grants. You know, and anybody who's applied for a federal grant is not just a blank check with a dollar amount on it. There's very clear guidelines that says in order for you to qualify for this federal grant, you have to meet all of these criteria. And there's reporting guidelines, there's transparency, and there's all of this. So when we say the implementation is at the local level, but the funding is at the federal level, that's a simplification. But it's essentially, think of it as a grant process that says, you know, whatever you're investing in, whether it's, you know, schools or infrastructure, whatever it is, it has to meet certain, you know, wage and benefits criteria. It has to meet certain, you know, technological and decarbonization criteria in order to qualify for these grants. And to be honest, we don't have to, you know, introduce something called the Green New Deal to do this. This has to be built into every single federal grant moving forward. And I'm saying this because the New Deal of the 1930s, there wasn't a single bill called the New Deal. It was a whole alphabet soup of administrations and bills that were introduced over a 10-year period that now we call the New Deal, right, as a package. But it came in bits and pieces. The CCC, which addressed, you know, environmental issues, you might call it, which we need a new CCC today to address climate change. But all of these administrations were introduced, you know, one at a time with specific goals and targets and requirements.
Okay. Adrian Russ asks, do you think a majority of Dems support the Green New Deal?
As in Dems in Washington, D.C., or Dems in the public? And I can answer both.
Okay.
Dems in Washington, D.C., probably not. Dems as in the public, we have the public opinion surveys. The answer is overwhelmingly yes. And those who are interested in this, just to see the disconnect between the 535 people in D.C. and the rest of us, Republicans and Democrats and independents, go to dataforprogress.org. And you can see this by congressional district. So you can zoom in on your congressional district and see a whole bunch of polling questions based on what they call the progressive agenda. That includes green jobs, Green New Deal, Medicare for all, rent control. All of these things are polled at the local level. And then you'll see the breakdown by political affiliation. People who voted for Trump, people who are typically Republicans, people who are Democrats, and so on. And the majority of these questions have like 70+% approval for Democrats and independents. And even amongst Trump voters, you'll see 35, 40, even sometimes 50% support, depending on what the issue is. So there's a huge disconnect between the Democrats and independents as the people versus the elected officials in DC. So to me, it's really clear when you think of the political establishment, the 535 people in Congress, the major groups that, you know, align with them are their lobbyists, the media organizations that spin their stories, and the super PACs that support their elections. There's a huge disconnect between that group and then the rest of the country.
Okay. Let's see. Next question. Of the factors, this is from Ginny McNeil, of the factors contributing to inflation risk, how does student college loan debt contribute? Isn't the point that the loan fosters greater employment and salary opportunities?
So I'm trying to figure out what the question is meant for. So I thought initially the first part of the question was a reference to higher education being a source of inflation. So I can address that, but it seems like the last part of the question was about getting an education leads to better paying jobs and employment opportunities. So let me start with the last part of the question. Generally speaking, yes, getting a college degree can move you up in terms of employment opportunities. But in the last 10 years or so, that hasn't been the case. And we're seeing, student loan debt becoming a massive burden on young people as they start their professional lives. And I know this from experience from my own students, from family members who spend the first 10, 15, in some cases 20 years of their professional lives. That's half of their professional life in some cases, paying on student loans. That means that they're not able to take risk. They're not able to switch careers and take time off for additional skills, or to start a business, or to buy a house. These things are becoming serious impediments to people's quality of life. So that's becoming questionable, to say the least, because we've never seen levels of student debt of the kind we see today. It's just never in the history of the universe was there any society that burdened its youngest people, most productive, most ambitious, most energetic people with this level of debt to get started in their professional lives. So I'm a big supporter of canceling student debt altogether. And those who are interested in the economic impact of canceling student debt, my colleagues at the Levy Economics Institute have produced a report about a year ago, I think. So if you go to levy.org, Levy.org, that's the Levy Economics Institute, just search for the student debt cancellation study. And it's a net benefit to society altogether. And I say canceling student debt, not forgiving student debt, because forgiven means that you've done something really bad, really wrong, and we're going to forgive you for it. There's nothing wrong about getting an education that needs to be forgiven. So it's simply canceling the student debt. So to go back to the first part of the question, which is higher education as a source of inflation. This has to do with multiple factors. Number one, with cuts to funding for state schools and community colleges, because when those schools have fewer resources from the state to support their students, they end up raising their tuition, which opens up the floodgates for private colleges to say, well, we're better. We're going to raise our tuition even higher, right? So that's one factor, but it's not the only factor. The other major factor for college, the cost of college, has to do with the healthcare cost that all employers in the US, struggle with. Colleges also struggle with private health insurance costs. So Medicare for all will take care of that too. So that's a feedback loop that feeds into college education. And then another major source of inflation in higher education is the cost of heating and cooling, which is again energy, the cost of energy. Another major source is buildings. And there's this competition, and especially in private colleges, of building the big swimming pools and the gyms and all of that, and the dorms and the nicer dorms. That's a component of it. But when you build those things, a huge source of inflation is coming from the construction industry, which is the cost of construction material, which feeds into it the cost of energy and transportation, the cost of labor, which includes the healthcare labor cost also. So it's these feedback loops that make the cost of higher education this extra source of inflation. But it's also the one platform that will allow us to move to the next generation of jobs and technologies and so on. So we can't afford to go without it. We have to reform those costs by addressing the roots of inflation. But that's an industry that needs to be supported, starting with public colleges and universities. That in and of itself will reduce the cost of higher education, because it will force private colleges into competing on that front, at least on that front.
Okay. Gwen Fisher says, I've been reading about our fiat currency as burdened with debt and mutual aid circles. Could you explain and comment on that?
I wasn't sure I understood the second part of the question. So I understand fiat currency, but what was was it a reference to a book or an article or something?
I think that they're two separate concepts. Like she's been reading about fiat currency as burdened with debt, and then she's also read about mutual aid circles.
Okay, I'm not familiar with mutual aid circles, but I think I understand what the viewer is saying about fiat currency and burdened with debt. So there's this this misconception that fiat currency, meaning the U.S. dollar, which is not backed by gold or silver or anything, is just backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, right? So there's this idea that every time the US government spends, it's accumulating more debt, right? And as I said earlier, there is no, financial burden on the issuer of the currency like the United States federal government. So every time I write a piece of paper and give it to my friend and say, I owe you a cup of coffee, that's my debt to my friend, right? I owe them a cup of coffee. That's a real burden that I need to pay at some point in the future. But when the federal government spends $1, right, that's an IOU also. What does the government owe us at the end of the day? The only thing the federal government is liable for is accepting that dollar bill and payment of taxes to the federal government in the future. That's the only liability because we have a fiat system. Back in the days when we had a gold standard, when the federal government issued a piece of paper, a US dollar, it was a liability in the sense that when I take that dollar bill to the US Treasury and I demand the equivalent in gold, the federal government is liable to pay me in gold, right? Under a fiat system, there is no such thing. The only liability is to be able to be willing to accept that dollar bill for payments of taxes, fines, and fees to the federal government, which the federal government can do without any problem.
Okay. Daniel Kennedy says, if there is a political window to pass a Green New Deal, but probably not to pass huge programs like Medicare for All and free college, are there other sneakier ways of addressing inflation, even if it's not optimal social policy?
I'm not a big fan of passing a piece of paper that says a Green New Deal just because of the name. I'd rather pass the policies that are in the package. If that's what you call a sneaky way of passing the Green New Deal, so be it. And pass Medicare for All, change the name, but as long as it does what the Green New Deal is designed to do. But on the inflation front, it's really about regulating and taxing market power away, because that's going to be opening, that's going to be the real opening that does two things. Number one, it gives us much more spending capacity because we're taxing and regulating that market power away. Number two, it's going to make the system more democratic, because when those corporations and individuals have less influence in politics, then the politicians, the 535 people in DC, will have to respond to the demands of the people. And overwhelmingly, the demands of the people are pretty much lined up with what we call the Green New Deal and green jobs and all of these things. I mean, look at Medicare for All. It's massive popular support. And yet, because of health insurance companies, because of the power of the healthcare industry, they say, no, we can't afford it. We're not going to have it.
Okay. Ann Caruso asks, why do we not hear about this from the Democrats in Congress? Is anyone talking about this other than the few like AOC?
There's lots of people talking about it. There's lots of Democrats and Republicans hearing this from their constituents, increasingly from their constituents, but also from many people who understand this, and some of my colleagues, economists who are working on this front. And they're, behind closed doors, many of them get it, but then they say, I can't do this or I can't say that until there's a critical mass of people who understand it in the public, a critical mass in the media who can, spin these in a positive way. And until we, and my answer to this is, if I had that critical mass, I'll vote you out of office and I'll have the right people do this job. So it's a catch-22 situation where they fear the reaction of the public if they switch the narrative, if they switch to a different message, and especially today, if they're labeled as the squad, then you know what the political implications mean for a lot of people, especially if they're in a purple district, right, or not a clear blue district. So I understand the political fears, but we only have 10 years to go. So if you're not up, for this job, and because you're afraid, then you should step down and let somebody else do the work. But if you're going to be a leader, then you should lead. So that's my take on it.
Oh, that's awesome. Greg Coleridge says, Dennis Kucinich, former U.S. rep from the Lakewood area, introduced legislation called the National Emergency Employment Defense Act that would create debt-free money to fund physical and human infrastructure, which would include a Green New Deal. It's based on a model called sovereign money or just money. How is MMT different than a sovereign or just money system to fund government spending?
Very good question. So now this is a much clearer question than the one earlier. So now I'm seeing where these questions are coming from, I think. So the monetary policy framework that is referenced here, it has been developed by a group of colleagues called the AMI, or the American Monetary Institute. I think that's the name that Dennis Kucinich was affiliated with for a long time. The main difference between the MMT approach and the AMI approach is specifically this debt-free money. This idea that MMT essentially says that the sovereign federal government can issue, is the only issuer of the currency. There's usually a footnote that goes with it, meaning that it's not just the federal government, it's the federal government and its agents. And its agents are banks who happen to have a license to operate as a bank. So the little bit of misunderstanding between the MMT crowd and the AMI crowd is that the AMI crowd believes that most of the money that we have in the US is created by private banks through the process of debt creation. Whereas MMT highlights that those banks can only do that because they have a license from the government to operate on the behalf of the government, to issue credit. So it's a technical detail, but I'm of the belief that if we have a chance to sit down and sort it out, we're essentially on the same page. But fundamentally, there is no such thing as debt-free money, because every time the federal government issues a piece of paper called an IOU, that's essentially debt, except the federal government is liable for accepting it in payments of taxes and fees. Whereas when a bank issues a loan to a customer, and most people have done this at some point in their life, when you buy a car, when you buy a house, they make you sign a whole bunch of papers, right? The closing documents. One of those documents is a very important piece of paper. It's called a promissory note, which essentially says what it says. You promise to pay back. That's why it's called a promissory note. And the reason that's an important document is because the bank has the backing of the federal government in court, essentially, because the bank has a banking license that allows it to issue that piece of paper to create the loan. So a lot of people think that when you go to a bank and borrow $10,000 to buy a car, the bank is actually taking money from somebody's checking account and giving it to you, which is nonsense. That's not how banks operate. Banks create money out of thin air through the process of lending. So that promissory note that you sign allows them legally to create $10,000 out of thin air. And that's what our friends at the AMI Institute, the AMI Sovereign Money Group, believe that all money is created through banks when they burden us consumers with debt. And the reason they can do that is because they have a license from the federal government. And the federal government, when initially we created the banking system, when I say we, I insist that we, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, gave these particular agents, banks, we give them a license to do this for the purpose of funding the construction of housing, of infrastructure, of building the country. Essentially, we give them this exclusive privilege under certain terms and conditions, which is to serve the public purpose. But over the years, banks took that privilege and ran away with it and abused the system. So today we could go back and take those banking licenses away from them if they're not serving the public purpose. In other words, we can take the same privilege we're giving it to private banks and give it to a public bank, to a state bank. We can give it to USPS to operate as a public bank as well, under certain terms and conditions, to serve the most vulnerable people, to serve the needs of the economy. In other words, we can say we want banks to primarily, moving forward, fund green infrastructure projects. That could be part of the banking license requirement. And if you don't do it, you lose your license. So it's, again, fundamentally a political question of that power and authority and privilege that was given to banks has been hijacked over the years. And the federal government sort of forgot or abdicated its authority to regulate the banking industry. So that's a long technical answer to a technical question by our friends from AMI.
Okay. Joan Grace says, these ideas sound great, but involve such huge changes that I can't see how they can ever be implemented. Is this really feasible in our lifetime?
Fair question. So what I believe is, we have a matter of a few years, possibly a few serious natural disasters, from climate change that will gradually, shift the political perception, not only on the climate front, but also on the inequality front. And we've seen this starting to build up in the US in 2008 with the Occupy Wall Street movement. By the way, if there was no Occupy Wall Street movement, there will be no AOC, there will be no Bernie Sanders, there will be none of that. There will be no Green New Deal on the table. So, and Occupy Wall Street was about inequality. It was a movement that put inequality on the map when, a few months before that, inequality was this, obscure subject that academics talked about. So those social movements are spontaneous. They were not invented by academics or anybody else. Same thing with the climate movement. You see the climate strike movement, you see the Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement. All of these youth-driven movements are not going anywhere. And they're going to get, more influential and more powerful in politics. We've seen it. I mean, they're able to unseat, politicians, then they're able to place candidates on the map. People with no super PAC money are getting elected. Not hundreds of them, but a few. And that will continue moving forward. So I think it's only a matter of time with more of the environmental crisis intensifying, with more of the social economic inequality crisis, with the Black Lives Matter movement, which is also a representation of socioeconomic exclusion that I highlighted earlier. All of these things are coming together gradually, not just in the US, but globally. So I'd rather see us, take bold action today rather than wait for more chaos and destruction and environmental damage globally to say, oh, now we need to do it. But it's a fair question, and it has to do with political leadership in DC. Do they want to, sit with the status quo and face the consequences, or do they want to be leaders and move us to, to a cleaner and more sustainable and healthier and prosperous society?
Okay. Brian Rice says, politically speaking, is the Green New Deal possible if the Dems control the White House, the Senate, and the House after November 3rd? And what about lawsuits?
So I'll start with the first one. If they control the White House, the Senate, and Congress, doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a Green New Deal. It depends on which Democrats you're talking about. For example, the leading candidate for the White House now on the Democratic side is Joe Biden. He's very clear. He said he's not going to support the Green New Deal. He's not going to ban fracking. He's not for any of these ideas. He's not going to, support Medicare for all. He said he's going to veto it. So I'm not holding my breath for all of these things to happen if Democrats control the White House. It has to be a different kind of, politicians, populating those seats. But with the current composition, it's not going to happen.
That's depressing.
Yeah. Realistic,
okay.
though. Not my words, their words.
We've got a couple of comments here from Leisha Farias. Great job, Fadil. This is vital information required for our decision making going forward. Sam C says pandemics should be taxed out of existence. Doreen Papachik has a question. How do we bring intersectionality into the total picture of political change?
Yeah, and I think I alluded to that a little bit about all of these social movements that are happening. And a lot of these social movements have been intersectional by design, or I guess spontaneously. And intersectional is this term that used to be, kind of monopolized by academics, but now all young people driving these social movements completely get it and understand the power of intersectionality. In other words, you're not going to win this battle of transforming the country if your main focus is exclusively and only, the environment. And if you don't see race, if you don't see class, if you don't see the other socioeconomic exclusion components of it, then you're spinning your wheels and you're not going anywhere. And then you realize that because of that intersectional perspective that you're taking, that you have a whole bunch of other allies and other social movements who also realize that their battle is interlinked with your battle and that we're all in this together. And that's what's making these social movements very powerful moving forward. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but essentially, it's really politicians who are almost by design not able or willing to see things in an intersectional way, because they tend to put forward bills and vote on things based on specific issues. So here we're going to deal with environmental issues, here we're going to deal with the police reform, here we're going to deal with military issues, without seeing that all of these things are interconnected. So you can't support the prison industrial complex in your morning session and then talk about social justice in the afternoon after you have lunch. You have to connect the two, that you can't support both, right? And I think increasingly the youth movements are aware of that, and they're pushing back against establishment political views that tend to kind of segment these issues independently. And that is only is going to strengthen these social movements.
I am trying to be aware of the time, Dr. Kaboub. If you need to go, let me know, but we still have several comments and questions. Are you okay with?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah.
Okay, great. Jane Flanagan says, hello from Sydney, Australia. Thank you, Fadil, and the organizers of this webinar. I'll be sharing this webinar widely. An excellent presentation and Q&A. Larry Hoddle is asking, what in your view should be the role of other countries addressing climate destabilization, countries that may have different drivers of inflation than the US?
Oh my goodness, this is a big one. But this is the one that I care about a lot. So if you take the framework that I presented today and think of the spending capacity of the United States that I explained, and the limits to that spending capacity, which is the risk of inflation, which is specific to the US, every country has a different limit to that inflation. So some countries don't have issues in the healthcare industry, don't have very powerful health insurance companies, so that's not their issue. But they may have, very influential, agribusiness industry or something like that. So in every country, you want to look at the spending capacity, that inflation limit, and then what are the shortage of productive capacity that you need to build up, and what are the the market power obstacles that you need to undo with taxation and regulation. But that applies primarily to countries of the global north, like the US and Canada and Australia and so on. These countries should have, Green New Deals on a massive scale, 20 years ago. So we're already, late on that. But what about developing countries who don't have that spending capacity, don't have the technology, don't have the productive capacity? How can they, participate in because we need a global Green New Deal. And in my view, there's a case to be made for what I call climate reparations and colonial reparations. And this is not my language. There's been a lot of literature on this, including UN commissions. So what we need at the global level, because we're all in this together, is something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for reparations. I mean, when people talk about reparations in the US context, reparations starts, number one, by telling the truth. Number two, offering an apology. And number three, repairing the damage, which involves financial reparations, financial compensations, but also literally repairing the broken system that produced that injustice, right? And that involves, quite a few things. So we have to think of this on the global scale with, telling the truth about colonialism, offering the apology, and offering the reparations in terms of monetary compensation, but also structural reparations, which includes transfer of technology, for example, which includes changing the global financial system that sucks money from developing countries at the tune of $2 trillion a year, net amount of money leaving the poorest countries to the richest country. So there's a whole, model that I'm developing for this. As a matter of fact, I'm teaching this class at Denison in the fall on making the case for a global Green New Deal with climate reparations and colonial reparations. And hoping that this will be the book that you'll see maybe in a year from today.
Awesome. Charlotte Owens came in late. She said that she had heard there'd be a recording. Now I know we're live streaming this on our West Shore Fact and Fact Ohio Facebook page. It will also be on YouTube. Just search the title of the presentation. And Dr. Kaboub, are you also posting it somewhere, the recording?
Whatever you post it, I'll post it.
Okay.
I'm not recording on my side, so
no, I am, but
I'll post it on my social media pages. If you follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever, you'll see it.
Okay, great. How can we make it clear to the General Assembly or to Congress that we want fair policies? How do we take this to our elected officials? Are letters, phone calls better? What larger groups are bringing this message with a louder voice to the federal government?
All the above. So you should definitely, every time there's an opportunity for a town hall with your elected representatives, send them letters, call their offices, introduce them to this narrative. They, as they say, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And I truly believe we're in the fighting stage. And this is about this MMT movement, because this is not new. This has been around for 25 years. First, they ignored us, then they laughed at us. They definitely did. And now they're in the fighting stage. So we're close. So keep pushing. So every opportunity you have to, educate and inform your policymakers, because in some cases they may not even know. But increasingly, the majority of them know. They just pretend that they don't understand it, or will, claim that, oh, this can't be done, or this will turn us into a Zimbabwe or whatever. But now you're empowered with a narrative that says, we know better. You can't trick us into thinking that this is hyperinflation type of policy or whatever. So you can push back, and you'll be surprised by lots of people on social media, in the mainstream media increasingly. You'll find people who actually understand this. So there's national organizations that you should, follow and support, including think tanks that do this kind of research, political organizations that endorse candidates. And there's literally, as we speak, dozens of candidates across the country running for office with an MMT-informed platform supporting the Green New Deal. And I literally lost track. There's probably more than 200 candidates. Not all of them will win. Some of them already lost their primaries, but all of them were canvassing before the pandemic. They were educating their constituents. They were challenging their opponents in debates. They were informing the media that was covering their campaigns. So increasingly, there's lots of people who understand this, who are empowered by it. And this, it's a matter of time before this new paradigm, exposes the old paradigm and its deficiencies and its weaknesses. So in terms of national organizations, Brand New Congress is an organization that I work closely with, and all their candidates have MMT-informed platforms. So that's Brand New Congress. On the think tank front, I mentioned the Levy Economics Institute. I also run an institute called the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. There's also, media organizations and podcasts, and there's a great website that a friend of mine put together with tons of these resources. It's called wecanhaveniceThings.com, I think, or maybe .org. Just type "we can have nice things." That's what it's implied. And you'll see the website with all the links to podcasts and videos and books and articles and all the key players in this area. There's a network called the Modern Money Network. There's an organization I'm also affiliated with. It's called Real Progressives on Facebook or social media. Real Progress in Action is also another organization. Tons of resources.
Okay. Bob Kloos, it's about that pushing for the Green New Deal thing. Bob Kloos says, for Congress to vote for the Green New Deal, it will have to approve legislation prior that deals with support of green energy production, elimination of subsidies for fossil fuel industries, and living wage minimums. Then the Green New Deal will be an easier leap. Where should we push first?
On multiple fronts. I mean, we're so far back. You've seen the information, the data about quality of life. Didn't move an inch for 40 years, right? You've seen the information about the minimum wage and how far back we are from a living wage. We need absolutely to push on that front, not just fight for 15. We should be fighting for 25, right? To make up for 40 years worth of stagnation. And that's why I mentioned in the beginning, we have to be radicals, go to the roots of the problems, and we can't settle for small incremental changes, because that's the recipe for a status quo, right? And that's what Martin Luther King says. He said, I have no time for the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. And that's essentially what gradualism is. We'll give you a little bit of a minimum wage increase. We'll give you a little bit of, green job subsidies here and there, but nothing transformative. And that's really important as a matter of political strategy, that we can't settle for small bits and pieces of reform here and there that are aimed essentially to tranquilize and kind of pacify the progressive movements and the demands of young people across the country.
Sam C says, I want to see more concrete plans on green stuff. Medicare for all is good, etc. What are the policies for reducing carbon emissions?
Okay, so on this particular front, and I say this all the time just to be fair and honest about this, the kind of green technologies that we have right now are good, but not good enough, in the sense that we have a whole bunch of low-hanging fruit, so to speak, that we can tackle right away, starting with weatherizing buildings, because they're a major consumer of energy and CO2 emission. And that we can do with existing technology today. We can put a big dent in fighting climate change. But I'm also, I think I referenced it earlier when I said we need billions of dollars in research and development to create the circular economy, where every product we produce and comes with a living will, so to speak, to go back into the circular economy. But what I want to add here is billions of dollars of material science research and renewable energy research to produce a different kind of solar panels, for example, and wind turbines that are truly sustainable. Because one of the things that we're not fully addressing right now is, what happens to all that poisonous stuff in those solar panels we have right now in 30 or 40 years when they become obsolete? Where is that going to go? Well, we don't even have the infrastructure to recycle it. So that's a dangerous thing to think about. If we scale this on a global scale, number two, the extractive nature of the raw materials, mostly from developing countries, and the impact on indigenous communities is massive and unsustainable. If we scale up solar panel production with current technology, then we're doomed, right? But we have quite a bit of space to go to decarbonize with existing technology. But we have to invest massive amount of resources to get to a point where we can truly be sustainable with the green technology. And it's just not going to happen without research and development. And it's not going to happen if we wait for the market to put the resources on the table to invest in renewable energy, because it's not profitable. Most of this kind of transformative science and technology research happens with government funding. When JFK said, we're going to put a man on the moon in 10 years, even the scientists said we can't, right? But then we made it a national priority, and we put the resources and the brain power, to work on it, and we were able to meet that challenge. And the goal, by the way, was just to put a man on the moon to walk and take a video. But look at what came out of that science and technology research and innovation. This, right? This laptop, this webcam, this microphone, the Wi-Fi, all of this stuff came essentially out of that massive amount of research and development that was intended purely to put a man on the moon. And then all of a sudden, all of this technological transformation that came out of it, that wasn't even planned, wasn't even part of the goal. And I believe that if we put our minds to it, if we set the priorities straight with research and development aimed at fighting climate change, decarbonizing, inventing and discovering new ways of producing things that are more sustainable, you can't even think of the possibilities that will come out of this new economy if we set our minds to it and set the priorities straight.
Wow, that's amazing. I never thought about that. Lori Babby says this has been very enlightening. Thank you. Martin Connolly is asking for a clarification. Is it the federal government or the Federal Reserve that actually issues new currency?
It's the federal government that, remember, the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank, is a creature of Congress. Their boss is the US Congress. The Federal Reserve Bank was created in 1913 by an act of Congress. It's called the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So they work for the federal government. They're independent in terms of their operations and so on. They have certain privileges, but they have to report to their boss, which is the US Congress. And just as an anecdote to this, just to illustrate, the Federal Reserve Bank is a very profitable institution. I mean, they don't operate day to day in order to make profits. They're not speculating in markets, but as part of their operations, they do actually generate income. They generate quite a bit of money. What do they do with their profit at the end of the year? They hand it back to their boss. They give it to the U.S. Treasury, right? So the setup of the Federal Reserve Bank is unusual, but at the end of the day, it works for Congress. So Congress has the power of the purse. It's the only entity that can create money out of existence, into existence. And the Federal Reserve Bank has certain privileges in terms of being able to execute the orders that come from Congress in order to fund certain programs. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a democratic process, and that democratic process is 100% within the confines of the US Congress, the 535 people we elect.
Okay. And then one final comment, April Stoltz, as to pressuring our political leaders. She says, change happens from the bottom up. Despite what Joe Biden has said, with pressure, he will change. Bernie has already had an impact on him.
Well said.
Martin Connolly says, thanks from Sydney, AKA Mac Sword.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, that wraps it up here. Michelle, back to you.
Sure. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this evening. Hope Like I said, it was really informative and empowering. Like Fidel said, called our bluff when our representative said we can't afford it, or oh my gosh, who are we going to tax to fund it? To have that knowledge to say we know better, and these are the priorities that we want and that we demand. Fidel, is there a place that people can follow you online, social media, if they want to check out, Twitter or whatever they want to follow?
Yeah, I think my name on the screen has the Twitter handle on it. But if you just Google my name, you'll find me on Twitter, on Facebook, LinkedIn, and feel free to email me. But social media is where you'll find a lot of these resources. And I'm happy to share links later. I mentioned a few organizations, but I probably forgot quite a few others who will not be happy about it today. So I promise I'm happy to share all of these links online.
Okay. I guess with that, then we'll call it an evening. Thank you, Dr. Kubu, for joining us, and hope you are doing well.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Take care.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye.